Hey there, and welcome to a new video on the Future Programmer YouTube channel. Today's Java Basics video is all about scope in Java programming, which is very important when dealing with Java methods. So without further ado, let's get started. Today we will be learning about scope in Java programming, and while this is not a concept that solely applies to only methods, scope is a very important concept in programming that can cause many issues when writing programs with methods. To start off, what is scope? Well, scope, as the name suggests, is about the extent in which something, in this case a variable, can be accessed. You are probably already aware that you can only access a variable after the variable is declared. So you can't access a variable before it is made. But there are also other rules regarding the accessing of variables that deals with the scope of the variable. Let's take a look at the code down below. So in this code, we have a pretty standard for loop where we have a loop control variable int, which is equal to I, equals to 0, y was less than 2, we will print out I, and then increment I by 1. After the loop, we'll print out I again. At first glance, this code seems perfectly fine, and it may be confusing as to why this would throw an error. Let's first take a look at what the error is. So if I copy this code into an online Java editor, like Replit, and run this program, we'll actually see an error raised on line 6. Error cannot find symbol. What this is saying is that Java is unable to find the variable I on line 6. So how can that be? Because we clearly made a variable I, which is equal to 0, and there doesn't seem to be any error when we try to print it out on line 4. So why can't Java find I on line 6? Well, the variable I was declared in the for loop header. It's declared right here, int I. So in this case, the scope of the variable I is the for loop. And this means that the variable I can only be accessed inside of our for loop. If we would like to access the variable I outside the loop, we'll have to declare it outside the for loop scope. So we can write int I outside of our loop rather than inside. So we declare our variable outside the loop, and then inside our for loop header, instead of writing int I, we just write I. So I is equal to 0, I less than 2, I plus plus. And then we print out I, and then we print out an empty line, or rather a new line character actually in this case, and then we print out I. And if I copy this code into our online Java editor, we will see that this code runs perfectly fine. And we will see 0, 1 on one line and 2 on another line. The line between those two is caused by this, which is fine. So you can see that because we made the variable I in a scope in which it can be accessed on line 8, we can access the variable on line 8. To better understand why these examples work as they do, let's talk about blocks in Java. And the definition of a block is the code between a pair of curly brackets, whatever you want to call it. This thing right here. So when you write an if else statement, or perhaps a loop, or perhaps a method, and even a class, you're writing blocks of code. So in this example, this is one block. You can see the curly brackets indicating the start and end of our block. This is another block, and so is this. This one is also a block, and this one is another block. We can also have code blocks exist without the aforementioned code structure, so we can just have a block hanging out right here without having to put it inside of an if statement or a method. They can just exist on their own. So variables declared inside a block can only be accessed in that block after the variable declaration. In the case of using for loops, we can kind of consider the header to be part of our block when we were considering scope. So in the code below, because x is declared inside of our if statement block, we cannot access it outside of our if statement block. So this would raise an error. Let's take a look at the output when I run this program. We should see on line 7, when we try to access the variable x, it would say error, cannot find symbol. To fix that, we can simply make our variable x before the if statement. So int x right here, and instead of writing int x is equal to 0, we can just write x is equal to 0. And this should solve the problem, so we can print out 0 and 0, once on line 6 and the other on line 8. We'll wrap up our discussion today talking about scopes in methods, since we're currently in the chapter about methods. Variables declared in a method can only be accessed in that method after the line of declaration, but it cannot be accessed in another method. So in this code, we have two methods. One is the main method, which all classes have, or at least so far in our course, all classes have. And we also have another method called sum method. It does not return anything, it is public and static, and all it does is it makes a variable int x, which is equal to 0. So taking a look at our code, Java will run the code inside of our main method, that's the entry point to our programs. So it will run some method, so it will make int x is equal to 0. But when we try to print out x in our main method, it would tell us that it cannot find our variable x. And that is because x only exists in this code block. So when we try to access x outside of this code block, Java cannot find it. Let's take a look at our program when we run it. So I can just copy this entire thing in here. And when I try to run this program, it says it cannot find symbol on line number 4 when it tries to find x, because x is only visible inside of some method. So I can totally print out system.out.println x and run this program. Actually, I have to comment this out because that will still raise an error. So after we comment out line 4, we can correctly access the variable x inside some method. So x is only visible inside of the sum method block, and it cannot be accessed in another method like the main method. So how can we access a variable declared in a method scope in another method? Well, what we can do is return that value from one method to the other method. In the last video, we talked about returning methods or returning values from methods. So in this case, we have two methods. We have the main and we have the sum method again. And actually, the sum method header is actually wrong. This should be int and not void, since we're returning an integer value. So this should be int. And when we call sum method, we're accepting the return value into a new variable x. And this x is very different from this x. They may hold the same value when we run the program, but this one is only visible in here, and this one is only visible in here. Let's copy this program into our editor. And before we do anything else, let me fix this return type to int. Running this program, we should see that we print out 0 just fine. And what happened was we go to main, we run some method, the return value is stored inside of x, we print out that x, because x will be the return value of x, or of some method, 0, so we print out 0. And if we have a method in, or a variable in the main method, and we want to access that variable in another method, like sum method, we can pass that value as argument into a method call of sum method. That way, we will be able to access that value through the parameter of sum method. So if we have a variable, let's say, pretend this line is up here, int x is equal to 0. And when we call some method, we want to access that variable which was declared inside of the main method. How can we do that? Well, let's practice it in the example or the exercise down below. So using the same two methods as the class above, let's declare a variable in the main method, give it a value, and try to use it inside of some method without passing it into the proper scope. You will see an error. And make sure you do see this error before you fix the error so you know exactly what the error message is going to look like when you have some issue with the scope of a variable. So take a few moments to do that and come on back to this video when you're done. So the step 1 of this exercise is to do something like this. So we have a class, we have two methods, first method, second method, first is main, and we make an int x is equal to 0, and when we try to call some method in which we try to print out x, that will cause a problem because x is only visible inside of this block. So we can use x however we want inside of this block, but we cannot access it inside of another block like this one. When we try to access x right here, it will raise an error, which we can see if I run this program. It would say that when we try to access it on line 8, error cannot find symbol. That is telling you that we cannot find x on this line. So the way how we solve it is we can actually pass it into a parameter of some method. So now we want some method to accept an integer parameter called var, and you can call this whatever you want because this is just a parameter of some method. And when we call some method, now we pass in our variable x into some method. So when we print out var, we're printing out whatever is passed in, and kind of think of this as we're putting something into a machine, and that machine is going to take whatever is passed in and print it out. In this case, we're passing in x, which is 0, so this would print out 0. Let's take a look at the output. And we should see 0 printed out. So we do get 0 indeed. So if you do ever see an error cannot find symbol error, but you swear you've defined that variable somewhere, scope is likely to be the issue. Now you know all about scope in Java programming. If you have any questions regarding today's video, feel free to leave them down in the comment section. If today's video helped you, please consider subscribing to my channel down below. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in future programming tutorials.